So at this time, I'll turn the floor over to yourself, and please feel free to introduce yourself.
Thank you very much. Thank you for providing me with this opportunity to speak to you. My name is M.V. Ramana, and I'm a professor at the School of Public Policy and Global Affairs at the University of British Columbia. I'm joining from the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territories of the Musqueam people. I carry out research on the technical and policy challenges of nuclear energy and small modular nuclear reactors, SMRs. I've published extensively on SMRs, including peer-reviewed academic papers, reports, and articles in popular media. Many of these are available on my profile page on my school's website. Today, I'll focus my remarks on 5 topics: the economic challenges of small modular reactors, potential markets for small modular reactors, the potential for manufacturing and job creation from small modular reactors, molten salt reactors like the Moltex SMR design, and sodium-cooled fast neutron reactors like the ARC-100 design. First, I'll start with the economic challenges of small modular reactors. And I'd like to start by emphasizing that small modular reactors cannot solve all the problems confronting nuclear energy, especially the inability of nuclear power to compete economically with alternative sources of electricity. SMRs will be less competitive than regular nuclear power because they cannot benefit from economies of scale. Building and operating small modular reactors will cost more than large reactors for each unit megawatt of generation capacity. A reactor that generates 5 times as much power will not require 5 times as much concrete or 5 times as many workers. Thus, an SMR will be more expensive per unit of generation than a large reactor. This makes electricity from small reactors more expensive than power generated by large reactors. In the past, many small reactors built in the United States were financially uncompetitive and shut down early. As you likely know, large nuclear reactors are uneconomical. Poor economics is at the heart of the consistently declining share of nuclear power in global electricity generation, from 17.5% in 1996 to just 9.8% in 2021, as well as the steep fall-off in orders for nuclear power plants from the mid-1980s onwards. In the 2021 edition of its annual cost report, Lazard, the Wall Street firm, estimated that the levelized cost of electricity from new nuclear plants will be between $131 per megawatt hour and $204 per megawatt hour in US dollars. In contrast, newly constructed utility-scale solar and wind plants produce electricity at somewhere between $26 and $50 per megawatt hour, according to Lazard. The gap between nuclear power and renewables is large and is growing larger. While nuclear costs have increased with time, the levelized cost for electricity for solar and wind have declined rapidly, and this trend is expected to continue over the coming decades. The comparison between nuclear power and sources of electricity like solar and wind is complicated by the fact that the latter sources do not generate power steadily and depend on how much wind is blowing and if the sun is shining. But as Dr. Arjun Makhijani and I have argued, the last cost differences between nuclear and renewables should be more than enough to allow for complementary technologies to compensate for variations in the outputs of solar and wind farms. Dr. Amory Lovins and I have explained how renewables can be the basis of a reliable electricity system, provided suitable and affordable options such as energy efficiency, demand response, technological and geographic diversity, and some storage are incorporated. Many other scholars have explored 100% renewable energy systems in different contexts, and Dr. Mark Jacobson of Stanford University has collected the abstracts of over 70 peer-reviewed papers on his website. I'll now turn to the second topic, potential markets for small modular reactors. Faced with this adverse economic picture, Nuclear power is already expensive, and electricity from SMRs will be even more expensive. It should not be surprising that there is little demand for small modular reactors. SMRs developed in Russia the KLT-40S design, China the HTRPM design, and South Korea the SMART design, which was licensed for construction about a decade ago, have attracted no customers. Although many developing countries claim to be interested in SMRs, none have invested in the construction of one. Good examples are Jordan, Ghana, and Indonesia, all of which have been touted as promising markets for SMRs for years, but none of which are buying one. In the United States, Westinghouse, the company that has directly or indirectly designed most of the world's nuclear reactors, abandoned its SMR program in 2014. Its CEO explained, "The problem I have with SMRs is not the technology, it's not the deployment, it's that there's no customers." Niche markets, for example, remote mines and communities, are very limited. My colleagues and I have showed that even in a best case scenario, namely if all remote mines and communities in Canada invest in expensive small modular reactors, their combined demand would be insufficient to justify investment in the factories needed to build these reactors. We also showed that even in this best case scenario is completely implausible because the cost of electricity from SMRs would be much higher than what these communities and mines pay for electricity from diesel generators. And I'll turn to the third point, the potential for manufacturing and job creation from small modular reactors. A frequently heard argument for SMRs is that investing in their construction will lead to jobs. This is misleading. The real question is whether such investment creates more jobs than would be created by investing the same amount of money in other low-carbon energy technologies. The research is clear that nuclear reactor construction generates comparatively fewer jobs than constructing renewables like solar and wind energy per dollar invested. According to one widely cited study, each gigawatt hour of electricity generated from a solar energy facility leads to 6 times as many jobs as a gigawatt hour of electricity generated by a nuclear power plant. That study compared technologies on a per unit of electricity basis. But when you add in the fact that solar panels are far cheaper to build and maintain than nuclear reactors, you can see that each dollar of investment into nuclear power will create far fewer jobs than investment into solar power. One attribute of SMRs, modular, the M in the SMR, means that these are meant to be manufactured in factories. That shift from manufacturing on the field to a factory would mean that there would be fewer workers needed per unit of nuclear capacity. What about employment at the factory? The simple response is that investing in building a product that has few customers can never lead to sustained employment. Imagine spending millions of dollars on a factory to make video cassette recorders. In the 1970s or 1980s, that might have been a good investment. But today, even if that investment were to create many jobs at the beginning, those jobs would vanish soon once it becomes obvious that no one, barring some retro VCR enthusiast, is buying their product. It's the same for small modular reactors. I now turn to the fourth topic, molten salt reactors, like the Moltex SMR design. And in specific, I'm going to turn to the SMRs proposed for New Brunswick, starting with Moltex's molten salt reactor design. Molten salt reactors have a problematic history that suggests that if they are ever built, they will likely not operate reliably, but result in various safety and security risks. They would produce different waste streams, all of which would require extensive processing and would face disposal-related challenges. The only such reactor that provided us with evidence is the molten salt reactor experiment that operated between 1965 and 1969 at Oak Ridge Laboratory in the United States. The reactor was riddled with extensive problems, both while it operated and the half-century thereafter. These problems were not accidents, but a result of the basic material problems inherent in the design of a molten salt reactor. Any other molten salt reactor will encounter these problems too. So how about sodium-cooled fast reactors like ARC-100? We know even more about these designs from the many failed attempts to build them in the past, and the news is quite bad. The problem starts with their choice of coolant. Because a fast reactor does not have any moderator to slow down neutrons, its core, where most of the energy production occurs, is necessarily smaller in size as compared to thermal reactors like CANDUs. Thus, the density of power production will be much higher. In order that the heat thus generated is efficiently transferred, such reactors require the use of liquid metals rather than the more commonly utilized water as coolant. The coolant that has been used in all demonstration fast reactors to date is a liquid metal that melts at relatively low temperatures, sodium. Though sodium has some safety advantages, it reacts violently with water and burns if exposed to air. This makes fast reactors susceptible to serious fires. Almost all fast reactors constructed around the world have experienced one or more sodium leaks, likely because of chemical interactions between sodium and the stainless steel used in various components of the reactor. Sodium-cooled fast reactors have also proven difficult to maintain and susceptible to long shutdowns. Decades after fast neutron reactors were piloted, no country has successfully built and operated a commercial fast reactor. This result is not for a want of trying. Nuclear institutions around the world have spent tens of billions of dollars on fast neutron research, reactor research and development, and on demonstration projects. Consider the case of France, the country most reliant on nuclear power in the world. The first French fast reactor was the Rhapsody, which started operating in 1967 with a power level of 20 thermal megawatts. The power level was subsequently increased to 40 megawatt thermal, but in 1978, a small leak occurred in the primary system, which forced the operator to reduce the power output to 22 megawatt thermal. Another sodium leak in 1982 resulted in the Rhapsody being shut down permanently. The second fast reactor built by France was the Phoenix. The reactor started in 1973 with a power level of 250 megawatt electric. But this power level was not held constant over the years because the operators found it difficult to control its operations, technically its reactivity. The Phoenix reactor suffered 31 sodium leaks before it was shut down in 2009. Over its lifetime, it generated only around 40% of the electricity it was generated to generate, had it operated at full capacity and all the time. France's fast reactor experience ended with the 1200 megawatt electric Super Phoenix. The reactor was a complete failure. It started operating in 1986, experienced a series of accidents, and was shut down in 1997. In the 11 years of its existence, it was in operation only during 4.5 years. Among its many problems was a reported sodium leakage in the fuel storage tank. During this period, it generated less than 8% of the electricity it was designed to generate, had it operated at full capacity and all the time. What looks great in slick PowerPoints presentations may not work well in the real world. In summary, France, a country with one electricity operator with extensive nuclear experience, scaled up from a pilot sodium-cooled fast reactor to a full-size one over a period of 2 decades with very poor results each time. What are the odds that a fast reactor designed and operated by ARC, a company that has never built a nuclear reactor, will operate successfully? There are also good reasons to wonder how long it would take for the ARC 100 to start operating even in a laboratory setting. Here again, we can look to history, and I will draw on the experience with fast reactors in India. India's Department of Atomic Energy, DAE, has been talking about fast reactors since its inception in the 1950s. But construction of the first such reactor, the Fast Breeder Test Reactor, the FBTR, started only in the 1970s. And by the time it finally started operating in 1985, its construction had taken nearly 3 times as long as initially projected. The FBTR's operations have been marred by several accidents of varying intensity, and it took 15 years before the FBTR even managed 50-plus days of continuous operation at full power. Even before the FBTR came online, India started making plans for a larger 500-megawatt electric prototype fast breeder reactor, the PFBR. In 1990, the DAE projected that the reactor would be online by 2000. Construction of the PFBR started only in 2004. By then, the official timeline foresaw the reactor starting up in 2010. The reactor is yet to start operating, even in 2023. The current projection is that the reactor might start operating in 2024, 20 years after construction started. Its cost estimate has increased from around 35 billion rupees to 68 billion rupees. In 2021, ARC 100 described an operational date of 2029 as an aggressive but achievable target. Given the track record I have described, you should be very skeptical of that claim. A separate challenge with fast reactors is that if and when fuel starts melting locally in a fast reactor, it will increase the rate at which this chain reaction occurs. If this process were not stopped extremely fast, for example, by inserting control rods that absorb neutrons, the runaway reaction would cause the pressure inside the core to rise fast enough to lead to an explosion. Such an explosion could fracture the protective barriers around the core, including the containment building, and release large amounts of radioactive material in the reactor into the surroundings. This so-called core disassembly accident has therefore been a long-standing safety concern with fast reactors and was a key reason that the Kalkar fast reactor in Germany was never operated. The site was converted into an amusement park and is making money in that manner. There's also empirical reason for concern. Sodium-cooled reactors have suffered numerous accidents, starting with the 1955 partial core meltdown of the EBR-1 in Idaho and the 1966 partial core meltdown of the Fermi-1 demonstration fast reactor near Detroit in Michigan. Both the SMR designs proposed for New Brunswick, ARC 100 and Moltex, also have the problematic feature that they will use materials that are corrosive and or ignite instantly when exposed to oxygen. These will eventually have to be dealt with as waste, but dealing with these chemical forms is complicated. For example, the ARC 100 design will use sodium that cannot be disposed of in geological repositories without extensive processing. Such processing has never been carried out at scale. The difference in chemical properties mean that the methods developed for dealing with waste from CANDU reactors will not work for these wastes without extensive modifications. I hope I have conveyed a sense of how costly and risky the development and construction of small modular reactors can be. I'm happy to answer any questions. Thank you again for this opportunity.
Thank you, Mr. Ramana. It's good timing. We will move right into questions. We'll begin with the official opposition. And Mr. Chiasson, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, Mr. Ramana. Thank you very much for your presentation. I have a few questions. The first one is you seem to be very concerned about the costs of SMRs. Just wondering what your feeling is towards more like the traditional nuclear power production. Would you be more favorable if we continued developing CANDUs here in the country, or just completely kind of you want to see Canada veer away from nuclear?
Well, the answer is twofold. One is, if you have to make a choice between a large reactor like CANDU, about which we know a lot more, about which there's a lot more experience, then that's better than small modular reactors. And because these are untested, and B, because there are good reasons to expect small modular reactors to be more expensive on a per unit basis that I sort of described in my talk. But the second question is, should we be building any more CANDU reactors? And my answer to that would be no. I think that right now, everything in the energy field, looking at all the technologies, suggests that it's time to move away from nuclear power. and to build out on renewables, which are the cheapest source at this point. And of course, renewables cannot do it by themselves. I mentioned earlier in my talk that you have to also think about complementary technologies and complementary patterns of sort of dealing with the variability of power. But all of those things have to be part of, that should be the front and center of any energy policy plan at this point.
So you talked, your first point, the economic challenges of SMRs, you talked about the alternative sources. So obviously renewables are, come to mind, wind and solar, but what other types of alternative energy can we look at? Are we talking about like hydroelectric, or is there something else? Like, is there fusion coming or new technology that's coming forward that'll be available in the next 10 years?
Yeah. So again, I think there are always new technologies that are out there. Nuclear fusion is, I don't think, realistic in any of our lifetimes as a commercial electricity source. But let's leave that aside. Renewables is not one thing. Wind and solar themselves have multiple varieties. Wind, for example, can be both onshore and offshore. Solar can be of different varieties in terms of the kinds of panels that you use, as well as the complementarity between the thermal solar and photovoltaic solar. In Canada, I think photovoltaics make the most sense. But other than those, there's definitely scope for small hydro projects. I think large hydro projects have a lot of problems with them that we know quite well. But also geothermal, and then presumably in some smaller niche things that could be things like tidal energy and so on. But I think most energy models suggest that the vast majority of the future energy needs will be met most economically through solar and wind. And so that's why we are sort of centering that. Canada is very lucky in that we already have a lot of hydro resources. And hydro can play a very useful complementary role, because the output of a dam can be varied from 0 to whatever power it required up to its maximum capacity at very short periods. Unlike, for example, a nuclear plant or a coal plant or some kind of gas plants can do it fast, but some other kinds of gas plants cannot vary their output fast. So there's a lot of reason to sort of think that we can deal with the variability of solar and wind quite well.
When ARC presented this morning, obviously they were kind of very proud of the fact that the SMRs, like the plant itself, leaves a small footprint or creates a small footprint. And I asked one of the other presenters about the concerns about, let's say, wind farms and the large footprint it creates. And the same goes for hydroelectric dams. I mean, obviously there's an impact on the environment, on animal life and all that kind of stuff. How do we find not a happy medium, but kind of like a solution where we minimize the impact, on either the footprint or on the environment when we're developing new sources of energy?
Yeah, great question. So I don't think let me first start with the larger point, which is that the amount of renewable energy resources that Canada or the United States, large countries like that possess, would require more than a small fraction of their land area to be used. Some of these numbers which you see floating around about what is the size of the wind farm and so on are misleading, because what they are talking about is all of the area in between the wind turbines as well. But in many places, you can have farming in between those wind turbines. Likewise, in recent years, there's been a lot of work on agrophotovoltaics, where there is some kind of agriculture happening underneath the solar panels for certain kinds of crops that require shade. There's also talk about trying to do solar on top of canals and ponds and so on, which will have the advantage of cooling the solar panel simultaneously because of the water evaporation, but also reducing the amount of water being evaporated from these canals. So a lot of ways to sort of reduce it. But the most important point is that I think the land area that is required is a very small fraction of the overall land area that we're talking about. Now, the hydro is a huge problem. I think I would never recommend building large dams again. Small hydro, I think, is a very different kettle of fish, especially when you're talking about run-of-the-river projects. Those don't require a huge amount of land and can be developed by communities in accordance with their needs and their values. The last thing I'd say is the bigger question that you're asking, how can we reduce our overall impact? That's, I think, a much larger question we have to be asking about ourselves as a society. How do we transition from a society that is based on large and ever-growing amounts of consumption of various goods to a society that tries to live within ecological limits? I think that's a very big question. I'm not going to sort of enter into that debate at this point, but that's what I think one has to think about in the larger scheme of things.
Thank you very much. I recognize the fact that you're concerned about the prices of nuclear electricity being created by the SMRs. I think it's a very valid point. I kind of want to talk about the Ontario government, OPG, and the decision they made in December to actually go forward with the small SMR. So obviously they got funds from the Canadian Infrastructure Bank. I imagine there must have been a study done on the costs and the output at the end of how much it would cost OPG and the consumers. How can they justify going forward with that project if cost is such a concern?
Yeah, I mean I have a sort of flippant answer, which is that they didn't consult me on this. But a more serious answer is there's not been a report that has been released showing that it is going to be economical. But I'll also say one more thing. We can compare this with the experience of a similar light water reactor, small modular reactor that is being developed in the United States, NuScale. NuScale started in 2008. It was anticipating to start generating electricity at that time in 2015, 2016. Around that period, in 2015, they also released the cost estimate of their reactor, and they at that time said it was going to be $3 billion roughly for a 600 megawatt reactor design. Now they have a larger design, and it is sort of the costs are just blown up. Now they have a 462 megawatt reactor nuclear plant, which is now estimated to cost $9.3 billion. And this is before the first construction has started. So in about 15 years, that cost has more than tripled in cost. And today, the cost of NuScale per megawatt is more than 250% greater than the cost of the Vogtle nuclear power plant that is being built in the United States, a large plant. When construction for that started, and that time its cost estimate was $14 billion, that has now blown to over $30 billion. So the point I'm trying to make is that when you make a theoretical study at this point, you can come up with a study that might show that it's actually cheap. But when the construction started, the long history of nuclear power construction shows that costs eventually will rise, and they will rise very sharply. And when you know beforehand that there are these things, you have to take any of these studies about the economics of small modular reactors with more than just a pinch of salt.
Thank you very much. I think I've got time for one last question. It's concerning the access to enriched uranium. It's one of my concerns with ARC is how accessible it is. It's hard to get answers, like clear answers. I think it's a market that's developing. I don't think there's actually, other than Russia, there's not, a lot of countries are trying to develop it and kind of create or start up a production of it. I imagine that the fuel costs, which we don't know what exactly is going to be in production, is going to have an impact on the cost of running the SMR. What's your opinion on countries who actually want to start up a production of enriched uranium, and what are your predictions of what that will cost in 10, 15 years? So obviously they might be starting the SMR today with the hope that it's going to be a certain cost, but we don't know what the cost will be in 10 or 15 years. So I don't know if you can maybe share some information on that or your opinion.
Yeah, I would be more concerned about the fact that you will have the HALEU fuel, the high SA, low enriched uranium fuel, ready when you want your reactor to be operating. I think that's the big question mark. The costs are certainly important, but I think there's another economic question that has to be asked, which is why would anybody want to invest in a facility to manufacture this kind of enriched uranium fuel when the market for those things is very uncertain? Yes, there is a lot of companies that say we would like to develop a reactor that uses HALEU fuel, but the question is whether there are going to be customers at the other end buying those reactors. And if those customers don't materialize, then you would never build these reactors, and then you would have built this enrichment facility for no customer whatsoever. So I think there's a lot of concerns there.
Thank you very much for your answers, Mr. Ramana. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
And thank you, Mr. Chiasson. Minister Holland, I understand you have some questions?
Yep, perfect. Thank you, sir. Very much appreciate your time here today. I think you and I had a meeting, we'd met by Zoom
Yes.
a couple of years
Yes.
ago. Perfect.
Thank you.
I just keep getting younger and better looking, so do you, so. I'm glad you brought up the Lazard report. You talk about the $50 megawatt levelized cost for renewables. Just to get some clarification, that's a raw rate. That's not backed with, that's an intermittent rate, correct?
So I don't think there is anything called an intermittent rate or something. The stability of a grid is a systemic property. It's not a property of any one generator. So each generator has a specific levelized cost of energy, and then you have to try to figure out what is going to be the cost of energy of the entire system and divide that by the entire number of megawatt hours that are being generated. But as such, I think this is a metric that is worth comparing.
Well, yeah, I wouldn't mind finding out some more information because I was under the impression that that report, as it related to the renewable, it was not a backed renewable with firm, from what I understand.
Sorry, I'm not understanding your question. Can you repeat it?
The extra cost associated with storage or some other form of firm power to back it up wasn't factored into that megawatt hour. That's what I was under the impression.
No, I don't think so. Certainly not the Lazard report, no.
Okay. So we talk a lot about the economics and the market, and we bounce back and forth with a bunch of stuff, but, you know, I'm just stuck here thinking people smarter than me with a lot more money than me and a lot more business acumen than me around the globe are in this game. You know, everybody knows the name Bill Gates. We all know that there's a lot of big wallets that have opened up. And even here in Canada, there's a bunch of big names, engineering firms, engineering companies. So with that being the case and the absolute need to decarbonize it is coming at us very quickly, I've heard a few times that we don't know if there's a market and we don't know if there's an opportunity. Is it really, or are we being naive to think that when we look and we see that many people lining up to put billions of dollars into this potential industry, what do we base the fact that there's no market on?
Yeah. Well, so I base my assessment on two things. One is some of the work that I myself and my colleagues have done, looking at different developing countries. Developing countries have traditionally been considered to be the market for small modular reactors because many of them have grid sizes that are too small to host a large reactor. And I mentioned the three countries that we studied extensively, Jordan, Ghana, and Indonesia. And there are a whole bunch of other countries that also I can talk about. So that's one piece of fact. Second point, I think, is you can look at the so-called market in the United States, in Canada, and so on, and ask how many of them are buying them in the kinds of numbers that are required to make small modular reactors a reality. So remember that the whole promise of small modular reactors is based on so-called factory manufacture, right? That's the M part of their thing. So if you're going to have to set up a factory, you would have to have enough of a customer base to be able to build a number of reactors and sell them in order to be able to justify the cost of setting up the factory. This is what in the trade literature they call a full order book. And the full order book sizes are too large compared to what we see as even the utilities that are expressing some interest. There's a lot of talk about SMRs and being interested in SMRs, but that's not translating into money on the table at the scale that is required. And lastly, let me talk about somebody like Bill Gates, right? So what is Bill Gates' strategy? I mean, I don't know, again, you'll have to ask him what he's going to think, but you can read what you can see what all he's investing in. So Bill Gates has extensive investments in a large range of technologies that are related to energy, including batteries, including all kinds of other things. But in terms of his nuclear investments, we don't know the exact number, but they are likely to be in the tens of millions of dollars. That's probably what he's invested, right? Now, let's put that in perspective. So I mentioned during my answer to the earlier question, one of the earlier questions about the case of NuScale. NuScale has, as of 2021, it had spent a little over $1 billion on its just research and development, right? And it was anticipated to spend another $500 to $700 million before it can get the NRC's license to construct one of these 77 megawatt units that they are sort of developing, right? So that's the scale of investment that is required, roughly about $1 to $2 billion. That's all the money that you require from going from one of these PowerPoint designs to a design that can actually be licensed by a safety regulator. A safety regulator, any good safety regulator, will be asking a developer a lot of very hard questions. Questions about, how will the reactor behave in case there's a large earthquake, such as what happened in Turkey? What will happen if there's a fire? What happens if an operator makes a mistake and presses this button instead of that button? All those kinds of questions will require a lot of analysis, a lot of empirical work to be able to answer, and that's what is very expensive.
Okay.
Bill Gates is not investing anywhere near that scale of money, even though he has plenty of money in his bank. Right?
So
what
let's
he's
just
doing
say-
is spending
let's just-
a few tens of millions of dollars and then going to Washington and Beijing and getting public money, right? So this is a scheme for private entrepreneurs to get public money into what they want to do.
Well, let's just say that that's what's being done, and you and I are sitting around and we're saying there's no market. But let me ask you this, if there is a market, just simply looking at the Western Canadian landscape, looking at jurisdictions that have to deal with federally mandated moves to get off coal, regardless of whether that source is a renewable or an SMR, I think it's fair to assume that there's a significant market. There's thousands and thousands of megawatts that are going to be required for the decarbonization. I guess, and as I thought through a couple of presenters, I was kind of approaching it, whether there's a market where, we're going to sell SMRs into it, but I guess let's talk about the market. I think we can all agree that there is a significant market of megawatts that need to be converted. Is that a fair statement?
Yes, that's a fair statement.
Now, on the safety side of things, let's jump to that. I read your report. I've read a couple of your reports, and they're very well written, and they're very intriguing. I like them. They read very easy. On the safety.
Thank you for those kind words.
Well, I appreciate that. I've been reading your stuff for a couple of years, actually. Susan O'Donnell told me to read it, and I diligently have every time I've had a chance to put my hands on it. But we did talk about, that being the case, I was that student in school that said, but hang on, hold on, what about? So on that, there was a lot of challenges as it relates to safety and issues and whatever the case may be. A lot of that centered around the 50s, 60s, through to the 80s. The VCR that I bought in 1992 certainly required an upgrade. And I see an absence of issues, like a lot of issues, prior to, you talk about EBR1. Well, people don't talk a lot about EBR1 because had some issues. But in the EBR2, I look at it, and over the scope of time from 1966 or 1963 until 1996, the EBR2 seems to have version 2.0 accomplished and overcome a significant amount of those issues and didn't have those safety issues. So is it fair to assume, with increasing technology, with growing access to information, and things that we didn't even know existed in the 80s, is it plausible to say that we're working through, with our regulatory bodies here in the country, to overcome those safety issues?
Yeah, yes and no. So there are some challenges which I argue have to do with fundamental properties of these systems, such as the use of sodium. And sodium's properties have not changed since the 1980s. And the kind of materials that we are using also have not really changed. The stainless steel is a base of almost all nuclear reactors built, right? So there's a commonality there. The second point which I want to make is I want to tie this back to the earlier question by pointing out that whenever you're trying to deal with safety, you are going to be increasing the cost of the nuclear plant. That is one reason why nuclear plants have consistently increased in cost. If you look at fleet-wide averages in the United States, in France, costs of building nuclear plants have gone up because over a period of time, we've learned there are greater and greater safety challenges. Every time there's a Fukushima kind of accident, you know that there's some things you have to fix in your plant. And the same thing is going to be true with all of these things. And so trying to deal with safety is not a goal in and of itself if it is going to come at the cost of higher costs. And now this is where it ties back to your earlier point. Yes, there is a market for low carbon energy, but there are many contenders for it. And SMRs just happen to be one of the most expensive ways of trying to deal with that challenge. And I've explained why that is the case. And so that's why I think trying to talk about a market in general does not help. I mean, there's a market for people who are traveling from place to place. And most of that, if it's long distance travel, that's typically taken up by airplanes. You cannot say, oh, you can have sailing ships that are going to go from here to London and we can go in the sailing ship. Maybe that's a good idea for climate reasons, but I don't see that as a realistic market that people are going to actually occupy.
No, I think that the market I'm thinking about is very practical removal from the emission sector that we deal with right stinking now. So the other, your research centers a lot around the fact that this is unproven technology, and I don't want to use adjectives that are incorrect, but skepticism is a word that's used within there. So I guess I'm going to ask you a question about the fact that the experience we have with the footprint, I mean, New Brunswick has had an experience with CANDU, but 5 or almost 6 years experience with the SMR file. And we keep talking about unmet goals and expectations, but here in the province of New Brunswick, we use ARC, for example. They were funded with government money initially, but met every target, met every timeline. And they're currently going through the regulatory process, and the feedback that we get and have gotten as early as today is that they're continuing to do so, and they're staying on that trajectory. So they have, according to the conditions of us working with them, done nothing but meet those agreements based on, you know, the EBR2 track record and a variety of other things. At what point do we start saying as a government, you know, our skepticism can rescind a little bit because they're actually doing what they said they were going to do and meeting targets? When do we relax a little, sir?
Minister, it would be disrespectful of me to say that, but I would say I would have to answer by asking, what are the targets you set, and are those the right targets to set for these companies?
Good question.
But this is, I think, a longer discussion. I think we're out of time, but I'm happy to have that discussion.
Well, I guess just for final feedback, the targets are turn the switch on, first of a kind. Okay, sorry, my time's up.
Yeah. Okay. Well,
Thank you, Mr.
See you in 2 years.
Thank you, Minister Holland. And next we have Ms. Mitten.
Thank you, Professor Ramana, for joining us today. I would like to ask you to elaborate on some of the things that were in your presentation. And I'm looking specifically at what you described when talking about the type of nuclear reactors proposed for New Brunswick. And so looking at point 4 in your presentation, talking about what's proposed for Moltex, you had written and you had presented that it would likely not operate reliably, and you mentioned there were basic material problems inherent in the design of a molten salt reactor. I'm wondering, can you elaborate more on that so we can fully understand what you're talking about here?
Yeah, Moltex is a molten salt reactor design. And as I mentioned in my presentation, the only experience we've had with a molten salt reactor is at Oak Ridge National Laboratory in the United States, the so-called molten salt reactor experiment. And it was designed to produce 10 megawatts of heat, but even this design power level was never reached. And the operators who were trying to operate it ran into some difficulties, even at the very low levels of power that it started off at. And so it never reached even 10 megawatts, as I mentioned. And it turned out that the designers of the reactor had miscalculated some of the heat transfer characteristics, et cetera. But the more important thing is, even at this low power level, remember 8 megawatts thermal translates to maybe about 3 megawatt electric. The reactor operated for just around 13,000 hours over 4 years. In other words, around 40% of the time was when it was operating, 60% of the time it was down. In comparison, if you look at the average commercial nuclear power plant in the United States these days, it operates around 90% of the time. And during its operational lifetime, the molten salt reactor experiment was shut down 225 times. And of these 225 interruptions, only 58 were planned. And there were lots of technical problems, including plugging of the pipes that led to the beds that were intended to capture and remove radioactive materials. The blowers that were removing the heat failed. The fuel draining through the so-called freeze valve safety system that was intended to prevent an action stopped the reactor, things of that sort. So there's been a long history of all kinds of problems that have been happening. And as I mentioned, these are problems which have to do with the basic technology rather than one particular instance of that. And this is actually why the United States, after the molten salt reactor experiment was shut down in 1969, decided not to scale that up in the 1970s.
Okay, thank you. And I'm wondering if you can speak a bit more to those basic materials that you're talking about. As you said, sodium hasn't changed its properties over time, and as you mentioned, it reacts violently with water, it burns if exposed to air. Can you talk about some of the issues that come up if something goes wrong? Like, how would they repair it? Speak to that, please.
Yeah, absolutely. So sodium has some other properties as well that we have to think about when you're talking about repairs and so on and so forth. When sodium is inside a nuclear reactor, it can absorb a neutron and convert into a radioactive form of sodium, which has a strong gamma emission. And so any kind of repairs dealing with sodium in a sodium-cooled reactor will have to be done remotely. The second property, and a very obvious property that one has to think about in the case of sodium, is that it is opaque. You cannot see through sodium the way you can see through water. And that means that you cannot actually see which fuel rod is bent without the use of extremely sophisticated tools. This is the reason why in sodium-cooled fast reactors around the world, when there have been shutdowns for one reason or the other, a small sodium leak, a small fire, things of that sort, those outage periods have been extremely long. So that's, I think, what the challenges with sodium-cooled reactors. So if you build one of these, you cannot expect it to be operating at the kind of high capacity factors that we see in CANDU reactors or in light water reactors.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for explaining that. And I guess in your presentation, you did talk about recent experiences. For example, in France, as recent as 2009 is when they shut down their Phoenix reactor. So this isn't all just technology from many decades ago. Some of these examples are fairly recent. And you spoke about India as well. I'm wondering, can you speak about, is there an economic rationale? Can you speak about the issue of reprocessing and extracting plutonium from spent fuel?
Yeah, the great question. So reprocessing has also been part of the nuclear dream for several decades. And there have been three motivations for reprocessing. The original motivation was the reason why reprocessing was done in the first place was to extract plutonium to make nuclear weapons. The bomb that was dropped on Nagasaki was produced through reprocessing. And that was the original motivation. The next motivation came about in the 1950s when people were envisioning a very large expansion of nuclear power around the world and concomitantly thought that we would run out of uranium. Neither of those has happened. The expectations for nuclear power were grossly exaggerated, and the actual capacities have been far less than what was expected. And at the same time, we've also found that the world has a lot more uranium that was expected in the 1950s. So that sort of blew away the second motivation as well. The first motivation is still there. That's a separate issue. The third motivation then for people who are advocating reprocessing was that it would be a way of dealing with nuclear waste. And the argument was, by reprocessing, we're going to be able to reduce the volume of the waste. Now, that's, again, a slightly misleading point for a couple of reasons. First is you should remember that reprocessing is a chemical process. You're adding some chemicals and trying to separate out different elements. It cannot do anything to the radioactive nature of some of the materials that are in the spent fuel. And those things are going to stay radioactive, and you have to deal with them in multiple ways. So what reprocessing essentially does is try to split up the radioactivity that's contained in one CANDU spent fuel unit and divide it into multiple waste streams. And each of those waste streams will have to be dealt with separately. But the most important point is that the radioactive materials that have the most problematic properties, namely the ones that have long-lived radioactive lifetimes, those will have to be put inside some kind of a geological repository, assuming that's the way that society decides to deal with this radioactive waste. And the size of a repository is not really set by the volume of the waste, but more by the amount of heat that is generated, which is depend on the radioactive materials, and also on other packaging that you require to bury the waste. So the bottom, again, what we can sort of see from experience around the world is that, and studies of repositories, is that the size of the repository is not going to be very dependent on whether you do reprocessing or not. Nor does the need for a repository go away. And frankly, I'll also say one last thing about these repositories, which is that even the idea that you want to reduce the size of a repository and that's somehow going to make it easier to deal with nuclear waste is misleading, because the challenge with trying to host a repository or find a site that will, a community that is willing to host a repository, has not been that of cost. It's not the cost of the real estate that is holding back things. It is the challenge of trying to persuade people that they should allow these very hazardous substances to be buried near them, where that can possibly harm their descendants for tens of thousands of years. That's not an easy sell in any case. Mm-hmm. And so trying to reduce the volume of waste is really not beside the point. So back to the fundamental question. So what is the rationale for reprocessing today? It can't be because we are running out of uranium or we are going to building too many nuclear plants to be able to fuel. It can't be that that's a way to deal with radioactive waste. So ultimately, the only rationale that still exists today is that you can try to separate out plutonium to use it in nuclear weapons. Now, I'm not saying Canada wants to do that, but I'm saying that if you are going to develop that technology, that possibility cannot be ruled out. Okay. And it depends on who you're exporting the reactor to.
Thank you. And that leads me into the last question I'll have time for. Professor Ramana, as the Simons Chair in Disarmament, Global and Human Security, I think I must ask you about the issue you just brought up, or about nuclear proliferation, about safety, about disarmament. So if you could share your comments on that, that would be appreciated. Thank you.
You know, nuclear weapons have been the challenge, have been a global problem since 1945. And the community around the world has been trying to get rid of these since the very beginning. The very first resolution at the United Nations was to abolish nuclear weapons. And in 2017, the vast majority of countries around the world got together to sign the Treaty to Prohibit Nuclear Weapons, the TPNW. And, many countries have signed it, have ratified it. That's the one promising development we have in the thing. In the meanwhile, of course, we have situations like what's happening in Ukraine with Russia and the United States and NATO sort of kind of facing off indirectly, and all the threats that we know. The Ukraine crisis also brought to light another very important danger that we've known about theoretically for many decades, but we are seeing for the first time, which is that of having a nuclear power plant operate in a theater of war. And the Zaporizhia nuclear plant has been so close to having a major accident for months at this point, and the risk is still existing. Right? So these are, I think, very odd times to be thinking about expanding nuclear power given these dangers at this point.
Okay. My time's expiring, but I want to say thank you for joining us today.
Thank you so much.
Yes, Mr. Ramana, that concludes our time for questions today, but I'd like to offer you a moment to make some closing remarks if you'd like to take that opportunity.
Sure. Thank you very much. First of all, I'd like to deeply extend my appreciation for being allowed to testify to this committee. I think that you are at the juncture where you are making a larger decision than just about small modular reactors. It is a decision about how to move forward on the challenge that Minister Holland talked about, which is about decarbonizing your state's energy supply and how it can contribute to the larger national goal and the global goal of trying to deal with climate change. And at this time, I think we have two challenges primarily with this. One is that of cost, and the other is that of time. And I think small modular reactors fit neither of those criteria. They are going to be too expensive, and they're going to be too late in coming. And I think it's best not to sort of go in this direction, which is basically going to be a dead end.
Well, thank you, Mr. Ramana. Once again, I certainly appreciate your time in appearing here today, the presentation. It was certainly an engaging discussion. So much gratitude. Thank you.
Thank you very much.